Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I am so happy to have this program. I saw the series that was taking place in Putney, and I was so jealous. I was green with envy. I thought, how can we get Meg Mott here in Brattleboro? And then she showed up in my office. Amazing. That's how things work in Brattleboro. So thank you, Meg. Mm-hmm. And she agreed to do some of her presentations here. So we're just thrilled. This presentation, as are most of ours, is sponsored by the Friends of Brooks Memorial Library. And they raise funds to provide programs and extra resources that we otherwise wouldn't be able to have. So, to the program. Meg Mott has been writing about the Constitution since she was a columnist for the Brattleboro Reformer in the 1990s. She got her PhD in political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she wrote her dissertation on the Spanish Inquisition. Right, I know, a murmur goes through the crowd. For the last 20 years, she has taught political theory and constitutional law at Marlboro College. Her opinions on due process in college sexual misconduct cases have been published in the Washington Post, Inside Higher Ed, and cited approvingly on Breitbart. Okay, not the polite murmur this time, open laughter. She is currently working on a book, Good Clash, The Art of Productive Disagreement, and boy, couldn't we use that? I can't wait to read it. I will just let you know that we will be having a follow-up to this program next month on July 10th, where we will be discussing the Second and Third Amendments as well. And now, let's have a big hand for Meg Mott.
Everybody for coming out. I want to thank Star for agreeing to do this, the Brooks Memorial Library. Also, thanks to Janice Chaillot, or Chaloux, depending on which side of the border you're on, and M. Richards, who are recording this. And thank you to Daniel and to Carla for our technical assistance. And a shout out to Emily Zervis and Janice Baldwin of the Putney Library, who approached me right after the 2016 election and said, we need to do something on the Constitution because we got to talk to each other, and this is something that we all share regardless of our political persuasions. So it was their brainchild, and I was delighted to be able to run these, to do the Bill of Rights in Putney and to bring it here to Brattleboro. So without further ado, and I have technology, here we have the First Amendment, which is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. And the language is very specific. We're going to spend some time really thinking about the language. And I'm not going to ask, well, actually, this is what I usually do in Putney. Is there somebody who wishes to read the amendment? Oh, but wait a minute. We're in Brattleboro. We're not just going to read the amendment. And here, Jinsey is so ready. She could have read the amendment. But in Brattleboro, Jinsey, it turns out they do things differently. They don't just read the amendment here. They sing the amendment. Is there anybody here who wishes to sing the First Amendment? Yes. Okay. Let's hear what you got.
Congress shall make no law. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion,
or prohibiting the free exercise
or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof,
or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press,
or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people. exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people, peaceably to assemble,
and to petition the government for redress of grievances.
and to petition the government for redress of grievances, and to petition the government, petition the government for redress of grievances, for the redress of grievances, of grievances.
So here we have the beginning of the First Amendment, and I'm just wondering, is there a composer in the room who came up with this arrangement of the First Amendment?
Yes, there is.
So this is Neely Bruce, who teaches at Wesleyan University, and we found each other online somehow, of both being Bill of Rights enthusiasts. And I'm particularly struck by what Neely has done for this, because that's a certain style of music.
Yes.
Yeah, how would you characterize this?
Well, this is actually in the style of William Billings. William Billings is a late 18th century American composer. He lived in Boston. He was a personal friend of Sam Adams. Some of you will have heard of Samuel Adams. And he wrote a hit song that was sung by all the troops in the American Revolution. Staunch patriot, really on the side of the revolutionary forces.
Wow, excellent. Okay, so we get into this 18th century, late 18th century,
Yeah.
and is there something about this kind of music? Like, how would you describe it? Is it shape note, or I really don't know.
It becomes shape note music.
Yeah.
If any of you are familiar with the Sacred Harp, this is the immediate predecessor of the Sacred Harp.
Okay.
There are some pieces by Billings in that book.
Yeah.
But there are other composers writing like this at the same time.
Excellent. So when I found out about this, I thought this is fantastic, because one of the things about reading a constitutional amendment is we need to get back in the mindset of the people who wrote it. Now, that isn't to say that I am a strict constructionist, as Antonin Scalia was, although he has his points, but it is to talk about, this is an old document, the First Amendment. They put the Bill of Rights in 4 years after they wrote the Constitution. And they wrote the Constitution in the period of 4 months. And they did it under terrible, terrible circumstances. They were in Philadelphia. No disrespect to people from Philadelphia, but people were urinating and pooping in the streets. They were slaughtering animals and throwing the offal, O-F-F-A-L, into the streets. It was a stinky place in the summer. There were no screens. They had these fashions, especially the New Englanders. They were hot. And so there's a bunch of these guys who get together in Philadelphia who don't agree on very much, except for one thing: they don't like a monarch. That's all they agree on. Everything else is up for grabs. And they come up with this amazing Constitution, which is not perfect, but does a lot. And then 4 years later, they begin to realize they need the Bill of Rights. And we're going to go into that a little bit. But we have to get back into their mindset, because, boy, did they pack a lot into the first one. What are all those rights? Star, if you notice where her stockings are, she has freedom written on the back of her stockings. Freedom comes up a bunch. Free exercise, freedom of speech. What do they mean by freedom? So this is going to be one of the questions we're going to ask ourselves tonight is, what is freedom? What did they think it was? And here's the pinchy part. What do we think it is? And my guess is we're not going to agree. Because these are the kind of, talk about putting it up on the screen, where we want it on the screen. Every single word in there, we could debate that. And why it has to be said the way it's said. The first few words are, Congress shall make no law. Well, that's pretty strong statements. And people tend to say, oh yeah, Congress should make no law about all our freedoms. But there's a bigger question behind that. Like, why should Congress make no law about these particular freedoms? Is it because no law should ever be made that restricts freedom of speech? No law should ever be made that restricts freedom of the press? No law should ever be made about the people to rightfully assemble to petition their grievances, right? I love it. Now people are we can let go of our screen because the singers will remind us what the actual words are. So there's one way of understanding the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law because nobody should make that kind of a law. That's very, very bad. That's acting like a monarch. That's the one thing we agree on. We hate monarchs. Or is it because it falls to the states to legislate these rights? Because remember, when these people get together in Philadelphia, they're not Americans. They are, I couldn't say Vermonters because Vermont really didn't exist at that time. I mean, it kind of did. These towns were incorporated, but they were New Hampshireites. They were Virginians. They were Delawareans, or whatever we say about those people. They were not Americans. So is it that Congress should make no law? Does that mean, well, that's because the states are going to do it. The states could legislate speech. The states could legislate religion. And the language around religion versus speech is kind of interesting. Or is there another way to read the limits on Congress? So that's kind of where we're going to be looking at tonight is why is this one such a big one? They packed a lot into it. And what does it come to mean in terms of who can legislate what and where? Besides the individual and the states as two places that these rights are located, just out of curiosity, does anybody have another way that they read that language? Why should Congress not make that kind of a law?
I suppose the question is, one of the other branches of government, should the executive branch have the right to make?
Are you Matt?
I am.
Do you work here at the library?
do.
I heard about you singing. Yeah. So Matt is saying, what
It's a
about?
simple question.
Yeah, it could also be, is there another branch of government that might do this, right? Because Congress should not make any law. Oh, but wait a minute, that's Supreme Court. Now, did they think that? I don't know. They thought, if you've read your Constitution, the section on the Supreme Court is very, very short. The mosquitoes were getting really bad by that point of the summer. And they had fought over the executive like you wouldn't believe. Like, really, were we going to have an executive? What was that going to all be about? So they really didn't imagine much out of the Supreme Court. Because that could be another way to say, Congress shall make no law. Well, let's watch how the Supreme Court starts to do that. I always like to go back to the old guys to try and get a sense of what they were thinking. And I can't go back to all the old guys who were in Philadelphia because there was a lot of them. And they did have a lot to say. And James Madison took pretty good notes, and as did some of the others. So you can read a lot of all the different arguments they had. But we're going to look at three old guys. I'm so glad that I see some Marlboro students here because you'll be excited by the third old guy. So the first old guy we're going to look at is Thomas Jefferson, an anti-federalist, and generally that means very interested in states' rights. The other person who's going to help us think about this is James Madison, a federalist. Oftentimes people call him the father of the Constitution. At first he said, we don't need a Bill of Rights, and we'll go into why, but he got behind it. Jinsey. Oh, so Jinsey asked a very good question. And if you have any thoughts or whatever, feel free to raise your hand or shout, and we'll bring you into the conversation. So a federalist is the group that felt that what was needed was a strong central government. Which is a little bit of a misnomer because federalism generally means shared powers between the states and the federal government. But a federalist said, yes, we care about the states, but we really want someone to organize us. In fact, we want more Americans and fewer Vermonters. Whereas the anti-federalist said, I am a Virginian first, and the United States has to work for Virginia. So it's a states' rights versus national government. And this is our classic Federalist, and I'll use those terms again in other slides. This is our classic Anti-Federalist. And then, just because I can never go anywhere without him, we have Spinoza. Oh yes, look at those beautiful Sephardic eyes. I just love this guy. And he was read. One thing I said about the guys in Philadelphia, they didn't agree on very much except that they hated monarchs. It turns out they were all fairly well educated, and most of them had read political philosophy. This is why I teach political theory. They read the same old books I read. So I have a deep affection. And Spinoza is going to become important because he has a very interesting way to talk about power and rights. Let's start with Spinoza. The purpose of liberal government is not to rule or restrain by fear, not to exact obedience, but to free every man from fear, that he may strengthen his natural right to exist and work without injury to himself and others. Some people argue that this is what was behind Jefferson's The Pursuit of Happiness, that it wasn't that you're just going to have endless Netflix streaming options, but that it was actually going to be that you could have the wherewithal to build who you wanted to be. And for Spinoza, the passions are key. And this is another thing that was true of the 18th century thinkers. They didn't do rational choice. They didn't talk about people being economic, self-motivated, rational thinkers. They said that all human beings were filled by passion. And it was the passions that drove us, and reason just trying to make sense of it. So that was their understanding. Emotions were the key thing that they were looking at. And government generally worked by terrifying people. That's how the monarch was able to maintain his rule. But what the liberals thought, and this is an early term, an early use of the term, was the whole point is to be less afraid. So if you have rights, maybe you're less afraid. But Spinoza was also a realist. So in this picture of what it was possible to have human beings to engage in a form of government where they weren't all terrified, he also looked at the reality of the human species. Does somebody want to read this first passage, Jinsey?
Experience teaches all too plainly that men have nothing less in their power than their tongue.
Yeah. Do you know that to be true of yourself? The tongue just wiggles and waggles all on its own. So this becomes important when you think about free speech. If you are governing people's speech, you are governing, I'm not going to say it's the only appendage we can't control, because I think there's some other appendages that sometimes are totally out of control, yes? But when you're thinking about trying to govern this, the tongue, Spinoza says, is ungovernable. And so here's the key piece. Marceline, do you want to read this one?
The rights of the sovereign are limited by his power.
And this is something he got from Machiavelli. It's all very well and good to claim that you are the sovereign, but if you can't actually enforce it, you're just kidding yourself. So power is relational. You can pass a law, but it had better be enforceable, otherwise forget it. And this, we could think of the war on drugs, which I think people across the political spectrum now understand that that did not work. And that showed how the rights of the government to enforce certain laws was actually limited because it was unenforceable. Because human beings were a passionate group, we're not a reasonable group, so we always have to be thinking about human beings as we are rather than as we would like them to be. And free speech becomes, let's be clear, we can't govern people's tongues. Because if you start telling somebody they should not say something, their little tongues will say, but I want to. So this would be Spinoza's understanding of how freedoms work. Thomas Jefferson, however, has a slightly different picture. Does somebody want to read Thomas Jefferson?
A Bill of Rights provides fetters against doing evil, which no honest government should decline.
So when we didn't have a Bill of Rights, when we just had the Constitution, and boy, the thing with the Bill of Rights is tiny. It's a very little document. If I were, and I won't, rip out just the constitutional pages, I would just have a handful of pages. But Thomas Jefferson and others said, no, we have to have a Bill of Rights. And when you make a claim like that, you don't want to argue against that. That is a big moral claim. If we don't have a Bill of Rights, well, the government must be dishonest. It must be evil. So that was his argument that he started making. We have to have a Bill of Rights. This is terrible that we have a Constitution, no Bill of Rights. But James Madison, who's a very strategic thinker, he says, wait a minute, I wrote this Constitution, that was hard enough. Do we really need a Bill of Rights? And here's his first argument. Somebody want to read this?
Bills of rights are mere parchment barriers.
Yeah, parchment barriers. And now, okay, this is one of these things, right? Especially if you get very, very excited by the Constitution and you think it's going to save you, Madison is telling you, get a grip. It is just a parchment barrier. You want to keep reading, Jinsey?
State governments ignore them whenever it suits their needs.
And notice how he says states governments, because it turns out the reason they weren't so worried about the Bill of Rights is because all the states had their own bills of rights. Oh no, they had their own Bill of Rights. That's who engaged in that kind of activity. And Madison looked at what the states were doing, and he noted, yes, you may have it on paper, you've got this freedom of whatever, but do you think the states actually follow it? No. He's a realist. And so his suggestion was, and he didn't say this, but, actually part of it he did, design the system so that ambition will counteract ambition. Madison never thought human beings were going to be angelic, self-governed, beautiful citizens. No, they were going to be demonic, and that's why they needed a government. And the only way you could work with the species is to set up the government so that ambition counteracted ambition. So that the interests of debtors and the interests of merchants in a port and the interests of Presbyterians would all come together and no one group would take over. That was his hope, which is why we're always arguing with each other. That's the design, people. We are supposed to not agree, because if we agree, we amass power. Jefferson had certain fundamental liberties that he felt like had to be included. We're going to put our singers on the spot right now, because let's see what was in the First Amendment and what wasn't. So freedom of religion, is that in the First Amendment? And what is the actual language? Because it's not freedom of religion, is it? Yeah, Matt.
No law regarding the establishment of religion.
No law regarding the establishment of religion.
Well, that's happening.
But that's all it says about religion, right? Or, okay, Alan Blood wants to jump in.
Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is really fascinating. We're going to have to hold on to that when we see what was going on in Vermont at this time. But this idea that Congress, it's not that you have necessarily freedom of religion, but you have, can you say your line again?
There's no law regarding the establishment of religion.
No law. And then there's this other line that seems much bigger, what Alan said, of the free...
No law prohibiting the free exercise of religion.
Free exercise, okay. So that one's very much in our First Amendment. Freedom of the press, is that in the first?
Yeah.
Yep. Protection against standing armies. Not in the first, that's in the second. Yeah, can you tell me your name? Ruth Ann. Yeah, so Ruth Ann put up the, sometimes it means victory, sometimes it means Second Amendment. Protection against standing armies. Is that something we're going to talk about next month, July 10th, right here at 7 o'clock? Restrictions against monopolies, does that show up anywhere? Not in the Bill of Rights. But Congress does have the power to regulate commerce. And that Commerce Clause is where congressional oversights of monopolies, I think we hear about that every so often, that's where we get it. Not in the Bill of Rights, it's actually in the Constitution. Habeas corpus laws, do we have that anywhere? Yeah, like...
Not in the First Amendment.
It's not in the First Amendment, it's not in the Second Amendment. It's in 5. I think it's in the 5th Amendment, right? And that habeas corpus laws is you have to actually be charged with a crime and have an indictment from a grand jury. That's all part of our 5th Amendment. Are you Ruth? Is that your name?
No, Jane.
Jane, sorry, Jane. And trials by jury in all matters of fact. And that's in our 7th Amendment, yes, and our 6th. So we get a bunch of things in here that we start to see is going to show up in our Bill of Rights, but there's more than Jefferson mentioned that's in our current first. And there's a big one. What did he not say? What? He didn't say anything about assembly, absolutely. And speech, he didn't say anything about speech. And the redress of grievances. So what does he mean by freedom, Mr. Jefferson? Because he's making all these claims. Look at this. Somebody want to read this letter to Abigail Adams? Beth, you want to read?
While we deny that Congress have a right to control the freedom of the press, we have ever asserted the right of the states and their exclusive right to do so.
Yeah. So it turns out this whole Congress can make no law, and actually means the states can be quite busy. Quite busy. Let's look at this. Vermont Constitution, 1786. The people have a right of freedom of speech and of writing and publishing their sentiments concerning the transactions of government. So this is a early constitution, go Vermont. But is this really freedom of speech, or what is this? Because is this the way we think of freedom of speech? Maybe that's what I want to say.
Is it qualifying just transactions in government, not other kinds of speech?
Ruth Ann. Did everybody just hear Ruth Ann? Is it just qualifying that public transactions?
It's not really clear.
What do you think, Marceline?
It's also, they have a right, but what are the limits of that right? It doesn't say that Vermont won't make any laws concerning that right.
There's all sorts of ways to read this. That if you were a state government and you needed to override the language because it was in your interest to do so, there's a lot of wiggle room that we're finding here, because it really is very restricted of what counts as freedom of speech. It's just public. Freedom of deliberation, speech, and debate in the legislature is essential to the rights of the people. Free speech back in the day meant public speech. It meant you got to be in the legislature and hear dissent there. It didn't necessarily mean you could say what you wanted on the sidewalks of Montpelier. Especially because you couldn't say what you wanted in Montpelier, and can you just tell us your name? Robert. Thank you, Robert. Great question. Why can't you just say what you want in the streets of Montpelier? Right. So if you offended somebody in the streets of Montpelier, you could be looking at a slander charge of that sort. You don't have the same kind of First Amendment protections that we assume that we have right now. And I don't think you could talk about anything that didn't have to do with a certain type of religion. Because this is from the Freedom and Unity, part of the same Constitution of Vermont, 1786, sorry. My numbers sometimes go crazy. If somebody want to read this, you should say it with great passion.
I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and punisher of the wicked.
Keep going, Marceline.
And I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration, and own and profess the Protestant religion.
Yeah. And keep going, Marceline.
And no further or other religious test shall ever hereafter be required of any civil officer or magistrate in this state.
There's your freedom of religion, people. Once you have, and this is what every legislator had to, so all the people who are protected by free speech, those who are engaging in political speech, have this, make this oath, and then they just do that once, and then they have freedom of religion. So in answer to Robert's question, you could see how maybe on the streets of Montpelier, you might not be able to talk about the Mosaic law as a higher form of law than what Jesus said in the New Testament. I don't know that for a fact, but you wouldn't have that same notion that we have right now. The expectation is if you're in Vermont, you are a Protestant. If you're in New England, you're a Congregationalist. If you're in Maryland, you know what you are? Catholic, exactly. Yeah, so you have a lot of freedom of religion in the United States. You just go where the people believe the same thing you do. So that whole red state, blue state divide that we're seeing, that's part of the way it was. Everybody was in their own little echo chamber having their same shared beliefs. And they were going to come together in order to deal with larger issues that didn't have to do with morals. So Madison, who sees all this and is like a little bit like suspicious, he begins to see, hey, I'm going to get with the program. Because if I come up with a National Bill of Rights, people will start to say, hey, there's points to being an American. Because if you have a Bill of Rights, then you can make these claims as an American. This could work for the Federalist agenda. Somebody want to read this? Adam, can I put you on the spot?
It is of great importance in a republic not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part.
So here we have two things that Madison is understanding. We have to be worried about monarchs and tyrants, and that's why we've come up with this bizarre system where powers are always separated because we don't want it concentrated, and then we're going to have a monarch. But we also have to worry about tyranny of the majority, where one group takes over and makes life hellish for a smaller group. And so a Bill of Rights, he began to understand it on these two different levels. It protects individuals, and it also protects the federalist system of states. I'm going to go a little fast through here because, okay, let me go. We are now going to leave the 18th century. And we are now going to, and maybe before I put up this other thing, that when we think about freedom, it's going to be a little bit different. The states are the moral authorities. They are going to determine what freedom of religion looks like, and they are also going to be highly restrictive about what freedom of speech looks like. So it's not as if everything's super free right now when they wrote this. They had all sorts of limitations and questions about it. So now we're going to jump up, just about, I can't do math. I shouldn't say that. 200 years. Matt says I can say 200 years. That sounds good. This is a big free speech case that happened. RAV is a juvenile, which is why we only know the initials. If this were an adult, we'd know the person's last name. It's going to be a criminal case, and it has to do with an ordinance that was in St. Paul, Minnesota, early 90s. This is, we're going to read first the statute. Somebody want to read this?
Whoever places on public or private property a symbol or object such as a burning cross or Nazi swastika, which arouses anger, alarm, or resentment in others on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender, commits disorderly conduct.
Right, thank you. And can you tell me your name?
Orion.
Orion? That's a great name. O-R-I-O-N?
Yes.
Wow, Orion. Thank you. So this is a very specific statute. It's a beginning of a hate speech type of statute. Couple things to notice is that it identifies some examples, but is not restricted to swastikas or burning crosses. It then it's looking for certain kind of emotional response, and on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, or gender. So, not surprisingly, again, given human nature, after City of St. Paul passes this statute, some young teenagers burn a cross on the yard of an African American family. And the teenagers get a good defense attorney, and when you have a big constitutional case like this, you're looking for good case in order to go to the Supreme Court. So you'd want to find some good kind of a plaintiff who will be compelling. So the fact that they chose teenagers makes sense. Here you have some young men, they're getting charged, their lives could be thrown into all sorts of problems. It's just a misdemeanor, but still, they said their First Amendment rights were violated. And we might say, you're supposed to have free speech. And maybe people would want to make that argument. You're supposed to have free speech, and St. Paul does this. So it goes to the, and RAV's argument. So as you probably know, before you go to court, you get to file a brief. So I just pulled a couple things. Here's the argument, and I believe in the reason of both sides of these arguments. So I'm not putting this up for you to then say, oh, that's a dumb argument. No, these are good arguments on both sides. So RAV's argument was, First Amendment forbids the government to regulate speech in ways that favor some viewpoints or ideas at the expense of others, right? And the St. Paul ordinance says you can't make certain kinds of nasty comments, but it doesn't say you can't make all kinds of nasty comments. Yeah, Robert?
Yeah, just one question about that. Didn't the Supreme Court also rule that you could burn the American flag, that that's part of your free speech rights?
And Robert is mentioning a case that happened prior to this, right? I can't even remember what this is called, but maybe somebody remembers. But yeah, there was does anybody remember the name of it?
No.
U.S. versus O'Brien.
U.S. versus O'Brien? Thank you, Adam.
They ruled that it's a constitutional right, you have the right to do that.
You have the right to burn a flag, so why is it all of a sudden? Yes, Daniel.
Another question. By this point, it had already been established that the states couldn't on their own, since it was just Congress that couldn't make it. Have the states now been forbidden as well? And when did that happen?
Daniel raises a very interesting point. Like, when did the states lose their authority over being the purveyors of rights? Turns out Madison was absolutely right. Once you created a National Bill of Rights, you have this big National Bill of Rights, and then you have these puny little states' Bill of Rights, and they became much less important. So was it that they were ever thrown out? No. It's just that something bigger moved into the neighborhood. And we began to expect and maybe this is me theorizing now, we as a country began to look to the national level for protecting our rights. But your point, Daniel, is key. And I want to make sure we go back to your point, because we're not going to lose it. That the argument here has nothing to do with states' rights at this point. So I'm going to keep going through. Did I answer everybody else's questions, though? Regulations which suppress expressive conduct on the basis of viewpoint obscure our goals of a tolerant, pluralistic society. I mean, if we're the kind of place that we allow people to burn flags, that's what it means to live in a tolerant, pluralistic society. So why are we now, St. Paul, Minnesota, is saying you can burn a flag, but you can't burn a cross? So that was and that was the side for RAV. Yeah, Howard.
It's interesting how long it took for the Supremes to decide that the First Amendment applied to the states. It was Gitlow versus New York in 1925. Which is within the lifetimes of some of the people in this room.
And when Howard is saying that, in 1925, Gitlow versus New York, because it was Congress shall make no law, that meant only federal legislation was constrained by the First Amendment. And it took a case in Gitlow versus New York in which the Supreme Court said, no, this is such an important right, now all the states have to abide by it as well. So there was always this bifurcated understanding of the Bill of Rights. Constrain the federal government, states can do what they want. And then there was this process of making it so that the states were also constrained. I'm going to keep going, just St. Paul's argument. Somebody want to read this one?
My turn.
Go, Jinsey.
Victims are targeted not because of their individual attributes, but simply because they are members of a particular race, religion, or gender that has historically suffered discriminatory treatment.
And this is a conversation, this is an argument that is still, I think, very important right now, where people are saying, okay, yeah, we have free speech, but we have to understand that there are certain groups that have historically been discriminated against. We're going back to Madison's idea that one group can oppress another group, and how can the Bill of Rights mitigate that kind of oppression? Jinsey, you want to keep going?
Experts agree that by attacking a person's community, one interferes with that person's concept of self and individual growth and development.
And this is a kind of argument that started to come up about experts. So they probably got some social scientists, and the social scientists said, we've done some studies, and when there is a burning cross, it is going to affect the African American community much more strongly. And so you can't do your job as a municipality if you allow this sort of thing to happen. So again, good arguments, right? And yes, so yes.
Was it never germane to the case that the cross was burnt on private property and someone else's lawn?
So, and can you say your name?
Kurt.
Kurt. So Kurt is asking, was it never germane that the fact that it was on private property? And in the sense of, what did you want them to bring into the case, Kurt?
Well, that the guys had no right to do anything on the victim's lawn.
Right. So they had rules on the books to haul these guys in. Trespassing, vandalism, right? There was already laws in place. They went for the hate code, or the St. Paul ordinance, because they wanted to, they being people who thought that was a violation of the First Amendment, why come up with some extra kind of way to criminalize behavior when you could have just gone to the original ones? And St. Paul says it's because we really want to hit home how harmful this activity is to specific groups and not to everybody.
That's St. Paul's strategy.
Right.
But the strategy was all in the hands of the vandals.
Why
didn't they do it on their own lawn? Then they'd have a stronger case.
Ah, right. So they could have, the vandals, if they wanted to make their own case, they could have said, we're doing our First Amendment right, and so we're going to burn a cross, but we're going to do it on our own property. Yeah, and then they wouldn't have fallen afoul. Oh, I think they still would have fallen afoul of the St. Paul ordinance, because if you remember, it had to do with certain feelings. And it was a feeling-based ordinance. So if those feelings emerge, then it was in violation. But it was also about very specific groups. So it goes to the Supreme Court. And anybody know what happens to the Supreme Court? It is, you know, Adam, don't you? A unanimous decision. 9-0. They actually have a lot of 9-0s. We usually hear about the split decisions, but there's a lot of 9-0s out there. Because really, it's a pretty open-shut case for the Supreme Court. They look at the ordinance, they look at how the case law had been ahead of time, they look at what the First Amendment reads, and Antonin Scalia has a great time with this case. I may not always agree with his opinions, but boy, he had great style. So he says, you can't have an ordinance with two categories of fighting words. So you can't say you may not have fighting words, that's a term from an earlier case, offensive speech intended to provoke against one category, and that one is completely prohibited, but then you can say something nasty to another group, and that's fine. One that punishes words that invoke race, color, creed, religion, or gender, but do not punish words that invoke other categories. So is there any category that comes to mind that St. Paul might have also been concerned about?
Education.
Education.
Sexual orientation.
Sexual orientation, right? You can start to see how they might add more and more.
Was he just saying this was a poorly worded ordinance?
He says that if you create two types of law, two categories of people who can be attacked and who can't be attacked, that's a problem. That's discrimination. That's not equal protection under the law. I don't think he brought up the 14th Amendment, but then he says you can't create a double standard. This is my great line. Somebody want to read this?
St. Paul's ordinance would allow someone to hold up a sign saying that anti-Catholic bigots are misbegotten, but not that all papists are misbegotten.
Right. So he's got a point, right? And you might also notice somebody mentioned education, no class consciousness here at all whatsoever, right? So you could say all sorts of things. This is oftentimes what happens is people start talking about political people they don't agree with. They say they're uneducated. So all sorts of class stuff starts to get built into that, or they're ignorant or whatever, like that unfortunate line of Obama on the campaign trail. Scalia is pointing to the fact that the ordinance creates a double standard. And then he has this other great line. Somebody want to read this?
Politicians of St. Paul are entitled to express hostility towards certain biases, but not through the means of imposing unique limitations upon speakers who disagree.
Yeah, so if the St. Paul people did not like what was going on with cross-burning, okay, now granted, cross-burning is a fairly horrific form of speech, but what he wanted to see is for people in St. Paul to stand up as private citizens and say, this is not good, as opposed to criminalizing it. So he was asking for speech, but don't criminalize speech, especially the way you just did. Yeah, Robert.
So public opprobrium towards that kind of behavior is sufficient?
That's what he's saying. Yeah. Public opprobrium against that kind of conduct is sufficient. Don't criminalize it. So right after that, there's one more case, and we're only going to look at these two cases. Virginia v. Black, which is another cross-burning case. And in this case, we have Black, who is a person, an adult, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, who had a rally in Virginia on private land. So it's kind of getting to Kurt's, was it Kurt or Kirk? Kurt. Kurt's point about why didn't they just stay on private land. So this was on private land. However, it was a 25 to 30 foot cross, and the rally happened 350 feet away from a public highway, so it was visible. So Virginia had a statute. So it's different than a city. Virginia has a statute, and it's unlawful for any person with the intent of intimidating any person or group of persons to burn or cause to be burned a cross on the property of another, a highway, or other public place. How is this one different than St. Paul? Yeah, what's your name?
John.
John.
Yeah, it's just forbidding an action. There's no caveats on it.
Yeah, so John said it's just forbidding an action. That's it. Yes, and Matt.
It talks about the intent, not the reaction.
And it talks about the intent, not the reaction. And why is that important, Matt?
Well, I think either one of them is probably hard to express, but I mean, hard to judge. But because it's the behavior of the person who engages in the act, not somebody who observes the act. So it's directly about the person who's doing the thing, their state of mind, and what they're doing, and not how somebody else reacts to it.
So just to make sure people can hear what Matt just said, this statute is looking at a person's state of mind, which many criminal statutes look for. They look for intent, and not on just what some random person happened to feel. You had your hand up.
It also says any person or group of persons, rather than singling out people based on religion, creed, gender, as the ordinance has.
Right, and can you tell us your name?
Jennifer.
Jennifer. So Jennifer's also pointing out how it's just a person doing something, and it doesn't talk about specific groups. who may have these certain kind of feelings. I think the statute also says a person or persons, but then it goes into all sorts of other things about all these different categories. So this is a very different kind of statute that goes to the Supreme Court, because RAV might suggest, is this statute going to get thrown out?
Although,
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
on the property of another means the property doesn't belong to the person who's doing the burning.
Right.
It seems like that leaves a lot of places where you could do it.
So, and can you say your name?
My name is Alix.
Alix? So Alix, and I need to, just so people can make sure we hear all the questions and comments. So this one says, before, I'm going to go back so that we don't get confused. Can you just say that one more time?
It seems that the location that's described still leaves a lot of places where you could burn across.
Just, and Alix is pointing to the geographical. So on the property of another, a highway or other public place. So Alix is noticing how you could find a very remote spot away from a public house, public highway, and you could burn across there.
If it was your place.
Or private property.
Because this does not say you may not be within eyesight of a highway. It just says you may not be on the highway.
That's true. That's true.
You can't burn it on the property of another.
Right.
So if it's not yours,
Right,
it's
but
anybody
if it
else's.
is yours, but if it is yours, that's the least.
Yeah.
You live in Vermont, it's on your property.
See, I think Alix is finding a way in the statute where if you had a very remote little spot away from a public highway, you should be able to burn across.
I think if you owned a property right on the highway and put a cross there and burnt it, I think the statute permits that. Your own property.
It does say on, it doesn't say near.
That's true. If you were, you're going to make a great defense attorney. Are you a defense attorney? No, but that's exactly how to think, right? It's like, wait, the statute, I'm not in violation because you said on, and I'm 350 feet away. So there was that element. Was there another hand up? There was that element to the statute, and then there's this other element to the statute, and this is getting to the intent that Matt was talking about. Burning a cross shall be prima facie evidence of an intent to intimidate a person or a group of persons. If you burn a cross, the state of Virginia is going to assume you did that with malicious intent. There is no performance art using cross burning. If you burn a cross, it is going to be understood as in violation of the statute. And when it's prima facie evidence, that means if you get brought to a jury trial, the jury is going to be told, you burned a cross, you intended to intimidate. So it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, Justice O'Connor wrote the opinion, and she said that part of the statute, maybe somebody want to read this.
Burning a cross is a particularly virulent form of intimidation. That part of the statute stands.
Yeah, so the part that we were really looking at in terms of you can't burn a cross, and the way they started talking about it became clear. If you could see what was happening from a public highway, you would be in violation of the statute. So maybe there was some other, right? But I like your defense that you're working on here. But this other thing, this is the jury instructions that declared all cross burnings as intended to intimidate violated the First Amendment.
But not flag burning.
What?
But not flag burning.
Well, because cross burning is illegal in the state of Virginia. I don't know if maybe other places. Flag burning you could do. But you can't in Virginia now say, if you burn a cross, you intended to intimidate. Isn't that interesting? Because cross burning might be understood as a form of political dissent.
Oh, give me a break.
So that's what she came up with. That's what she came up with. And I think this was an 8-1 decision. 8-1 decision. There was one dissent. This is like the toll. For whom does the bell toll? Does it toll for Sandra Day? Ruth Ann, you may say yes. Here's our one dissent. Cross burning is always intended to terrorize and intimidate. He spoke. Yeah, Clarence Thomas spoke. Exactly. So it did not carry the court, but that was an argument that Clarence Thomas made for, if somebody burns a cross in the state of Virginia, that's intended to intimidate. And a jury should be told that's intended to intimidate. End of story. But that did not prevail. So I want to make sure that we have time for more conversations. So I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but this is getting us closer to nowadays, speech codes, because this is a big point on college campuses. Last time I did this in Putney, we talked about what happened in Middlebury College, because we did it in 2017, and it just happened in Middlebury College where there was protest. So we got into some of that. We're not going to take that kind of time this evening. But I wanted just to get these arguments back out there. When we decide racist speech must be tolerated, we are asking blacks and other subordinate groups to bear the burden for the good of the all. This was Charles Lawrence, a law professor, and he said this in 1990, just as these conversations are starting. So free speech, he's saying, should be limited because otherwise one group is asking another group to take the burden of the free speech. Authorities must address harm suffered by marginalized students, residents. So college, when it stopped working well in places like St. Paul, it became a big effort on college campuses. We are going to train the new leaders of America in order to address the harm suffered, and we're going to be much more restrictive of what can be said. And if you are a private institution, then there is no First Amendment protection. So here's another argument for restricting speech, whether in a town or on a college campus. And changing demographics require changing social norms. Speech codes change norms. So this is another way of saying, okay, I hope we all realize that we never had absolute free speech. Certainly states were going to override it to meet their needs. And then there's libel, slander, fighting words, all sorts of other restrictions on it. But here's an idea that if we change the laws, we might be able to change norms. Arguments against speech codes. Somebody want to read this?
Freedom of oppression, and especially the protection of dissident speech, is an anti-majoritarian principle.
So this idea that Jinsey just read, that if you allow lots of different kinds of speech, you're going to be more likely to get dissident speech. You may also get offensive speech. But the minute you start marshaling what can be said and what can't be said, the ability to get dissident speech out there is greatly reduced. Here's another argument. Censorship gives too much authority to government/authorities, the administration. When you give people speech code capacities, then you're giving an awful lot of censorship to people in charge. And maybe you feel like that's a good thing because otherwise these harms are just going to be reproduced. But if you're afraid of concentrations of power, it might give you pause. And so this is why generally the response has been, that the response to hate speech should be more speech.
How about shut up?
Or Jinsey says a simple shut up. Yeah. And John?
Yes. I just think of the no-calling radio in Rwanda and all sorts of free speech there that led to 800,000 deaths. Where would be more speech come in? I mean, one of the challenges of this is, particularly in a capitalist society, he who controls money controls the radio waves, controls the speech.
So John was talking about what happened in Rwanda of how the radio was used to foment hatred toward an ethnic minority. 800,000 people were killed. And John is saying in a capitalist society, a free market society, that means whoever has the money is going to control the airwaves. And what do we do about that? I mean, that's our big question. We could have all the free speech, but if we don't have free access or similar access, how can you combat it? I did want to get back to Daniel's point, because this is the fun thing about going back in time. We can take a current controversy and we can look at the way the argument is currently framed. But then if you want to expand your brain, you can bring in one of the old guys and say, what would the old guy have to say? So I always love playing that game. I mean, that's why I read these old guys. What would they say about this? Jefferson would say the rights of the people are best protected by their states. So maybe one state comes up with an experiment around speech codes, and another state does something very different. And you know, we're talking about a time where people didn't move so much. Well, I'm beginning to wonder if people are going to start to hole up in their little enclaves more. And so you could have these different groups where the states have different understandings of what constitutes proper speech, and that it's not free speech, it's regulated by the states. Although somebody may have something to say about it in that Supreme Court. Yes?
Well, I mean, I think the theory, or one possible theory there is you move to the state that has the laws that suit you.
Yes.
But that presupposes the ability to move.
Right, so
and
Matt's...
that's very different for different people, of course.
Yeah, so Matt is saying, and this is how they felt about religion, right? So Catholics were going to have to find, if somebody converted to Catholicism who lived in Massachusetts, they're going to have to scuttle down to Maryland. And it means you have to have that kind of access to that, that kind of mobility. But that is the history that we have. We solve it on a state-by-state level. I'm going to guess that that may be the case around abortion rights or reproductive rights. I don't know. Wouldn't surprise me. Although there's that Supreme Court again. And so Jefferson would say, I think, let each state decide the morals of its residents. Because hate speech is a lot about morality. And trying to figure out what kind of morals you can live with and what kind of morals you can't live with. I think Madison, to play my game a little bit further, Madison is going to say, go ahead and make all the rules you want, but states are going to override it every time it fits their interests. If a certain state says, okay, we're not going to allow something to be said, and corporations say we love that kind of stuff, so we'll do all our filming there. What if they say, no, we aren't going to, or we're going to come up with a whole different set of codes, and we're going to allow all sorts of virulent speech, then I could imagine corporations saying, we're going to get out of that state, because we aren't going to do well if we're associated with your toxic brand. And Madison would say, let Congress protect the rights of the people. And certainly that is what has been happening with the civil rights movement, as Congress began to decide what rights should get protected and how.
Doesn't he have a rather idealistic view of Congress? I mean, why won't the national government also override those when it sees
Yeah, so Matt's saying, so isn't that rather idealistic as a picture about Congress? You know what was so great about living at that time? There was no Congress. It was a figment of your imagination. And you could imagine how fantastic it was going to be. It was going to be finally the political institution that could solve all the problems that we have. So yes, Matt's point though is, yeah, Congress could be just as corrupt as any other group. But it was designed.
Not that that would ever happen.
Yes, right. But we also can see, particularly after the Civil War, Congress stepped in big time to try and create new norms. And too bad they didn't go as far as they could have gone, because they got a little bit further, and my guess is they were just tired of bloodshed. But that was a big effort to change norms in the United States after the Civil War, and it was Congress, so, you know. And so I just reiterated Madison's point that you'd want to try and design ways to reduce hate in such a way that ambitions are counteracting other social injustice. And then I got to just end with Spinoza. What would Spinoza say? Individuals have very little control over the tongue. Don't go down that road, people. Do not try and regulate those tongues, because they'll go wiggle waggle, and then you're going to have to put them in jail. It's going to just be a problem. And if you try to legislate speech, you'll just end up looking weak, so beware of that, lawmakers. You may look good for a while, and then when it actually starts to getting into cases, you may look kind of dumb. Maybe not. If you were in a state that really was behind this initiative all the way through, you might be okay. And Spinoza would say, I think, better to reduce fear than punish speech. And how to go about doing that. More conversations with people who don't normally talk to each other. More public conversations. So I think this is my last slide. How free is speech? Few can control their tongues, let alone someone else's. So free speech, if we think of free as in free will, you're barking up the wrong tree. Because free speech, it's not controlled by free will. States have a history of regulating freedoms. Why not speech? Sure. Go ahead and try that experiment. That's our history. And then, here's the clincher. Federal courts oversee how states regulate free speech. So the big takeaway, and it's going to probably be this for every single one we do on the Bill of Rights, is the last word is the Supreme Court. So Congress can do all sorts of things, but the group that really defines what it is we can do is the Supreme Court. So anyway, are there any questions, or we have some time? Alan.
Well, as we were talking about free speech and thinking about, about hate speech, and thinking, is it more important to limit this hate so that things don't get worse, or is it more important to have the free speech? Rwanda was brought up, but I keep thinking of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And present-day Germany, there's a lot of limitations on hate speech that we don't have in this country, which have to do with their history of Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting comparison, and you can see where they're coming from with that.
Mm-hmm. So Alan is talking about in Germany, after World War II, Germany has a lot of restrictions on speech. There are hate speech codes in Germany. You can't be a Holocaust denier, right? And you can't, maybe does anybody here know more about, can you join, because some of the parties, they say, well, you can go to the right on a party, but if it starts to seem like it's espousing Nazism, then that's against the law. And it seemed like, Alan, your point was that can be beneficial in changing norms.
I mean, if you think about not just what's legal, but what's right, there's things to be said on both sides here.
Yeah, right. And Alan's point, if it's not legal, we don't always have law and right. They're not always like this. So Wendy and then Neely.
Yeah, you said that Spinoza might say it's better to reduce fear than to punish speech. Do you think he'd be talking about internally or externally? Like people would handle their own capacity to not fear, or that we have to do it from the outside to prevent things that would...
Oh, Wendy, I was so hoping somebody would ask that kind of question. And did everybody hear what Wendy? Okay, so Wendy was asking about Spinoza's point about, is he talking about changing the internal picture, or is he talking about managing the external? So much of what we talked about tonight has to do with laws that are trying to change external. For Spinoza, the key work is internal. The way that, and I almost put this slide in, but I thought, oh, this is going on way too long. And I was, anyway, his comment is, if you wish to reduce fear, it is best to meditate on the common wrongs of men. And imagine people doing the terrible, terrible things and saying horrible things to you, and then to also imagine yourself responding with nobility. That's the term he would use. That is how he understood we reduce fear. So rather than always thinking, oh my God, this is going to happen and this I have to respond to, he, like a Stoic, would counsel everybody, you want to reduce fear? Imagine the worst thing you could imagine, and then think about how you can respond with nobility, which means concern for the other person and much more concern for your own self-development. Because remember what he said, the purpose of a liberal government is to reduce people's fear so that you can develop become the kind of person you want to be. Yeah, so there's a lot of internal work. Neely.
I'd like to follow up on the comment about Holocaust denying.
Yeah.
France, I believe, also has a law against Holocaust denying. There was a very famous case of a university professor there who basically openly denied the Holocaust, and he was put in jail. And of course, you can deny the Holocaust, and you can deny all kinds of other things in this society, but there are different kinds of denial too, because you can deny things that are established, scientific principle, for example, which is a very much a current issue on a number of fronts. But in the case of Holocaust denying, it's a denial of a situation that's historical and for which the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. And this is really, what's the free speech in a situation where you can overwhelmingly deny evidence?
Okay, so Neely's bringing in a point, and it's coming out of France, which also has a Holocaust denial statute or something. But Neely, what I really hear in your question is, what about somebody saying something when it's so clearly not true because the evidence is completely against it?
Isn't it 1984 when the final test is you're confronted with something, you see it with your own eyes,
yes,
and you're asked to deny it while you're seeing it with your own eyes?
So you're asked to deny it while you're seeing it with your own eyes. Okay, so some of this is also a question for me, at least. I tend to be somebody who thinks speech, I like the idea of it being free speech. If somebody wants to say that the clouds are now red and kind of LSD-inspired purple, and everybody else looks and says, no, they aren't that color, I still feel like somebody, personally, for myself, and I think the Supreme Court would argue, you can make absurd statements. But when you are forced to say something to be true, that to me is starting to move into a religion context. And then you have a notion of, have we developed a theocracy, even though nobody's calling themselves priests, which is a slightly different dilemma. So I don't know if I fully answered it, but I think there's elements where a lot of times what we're talking about is a religion, and it has a lot to do with our background in Vermont, with you're fine to say whatever you want to say as long as you believe this one sect of Christianity. And that's where the free speech, free religion kind of hit together. Marcelin and then Robert.
I was just going to add to the previous question or comment about Spinoza, and just that the work that he says we should do it within ourselves and the kind of like ethical recommendations that we need to meditate on those fears and try to be better at handling them. It is also the government's job to lessen the fear in its people, and so that means that it's not to prevent other people from doing things that make people afraid. It's that it doing other things that enable, like in education is a big example, like building the kind of awarenesses and meditations throughout like children's lives that lead them to think differently about bad things.
Yeah.
And that's one example.
Right.
But so rather than limiting what can be said out loud, because when we have those clashes and interactions that are bad, we can learn from them or see things in them and prompt more conversations. So there shouldn't be a limit on the speech, but like ethical support in other ways that the government can provide. Like even just like all the things that can cause fear, like food,
like
scarcity,
what?
Food scarcity, economics, all of these things that can make people hateful or afraid. The government should be making people stronger,
right?
Than,
right. So Marcelin is really reinforcing this notion of, for Spinoza, it's not going to be good government policy to limit speech. It is good government policy to encourage people to have the kind of awareness so that they can try out different ideas. And you were saying that there's a real ethical component to this. So the job of the government is to teach people how to not be so afraid. And to go to Neely's point, one of the key pieces he asks people not to be afraid of is superstitious reasoning. I don't see him as somebody who was against religion. However, he was very, very suspicious of how hopes and fears were being used and superstitious reasoning in order to get people much more docile. And so, to Neely's point about you want people to understand what superstitious logic looks like and how you're being manipulated. Key lesson, we all need to understand how easily we're manipulated by hopes and fears. And then Robert had his hand up, and then we're going to maybe one or two questions.
I just want to bring a recent example in concerning the First Amendment and how it is ruled on. If someone publicly calls for the assassination of a sitting president, no matter what the party or the person is that constitutionally legal?
I understood that if you are specific in your threat about the individuals, like you can say, I hate, something about F the presidents.
No, I'm not talking about that. There
Right.
are people who've actually, on social media platforms,
Yeah.
and publicly called for the assassination of the current sitting president.
Right.
Does that fall within the preview of the First Amendment?
I don't think so. And I think...
So there are consequences.
Yeah, in fact, in the RAV decision, that was one of the cases where they said you can be brought in for intimidation and threatening behavior when you're making that kind of a claim. Because did you want to jump in on that, Orion, or because you seem to have some background in terms of...
Quite, it's my problem, I can't quite hear everything you said.
Oh, Robert, I'm just going to repeat it one more time. So the question is, can you make a claim on social media that you wish to assassinate a current sitting president and say that that's protected by free speech? I don't believe you can.
So why isn't it taken down?
So why isn't it taken down?
Why isn't it taken down?
That would be, well, this is our monopoly issue. The Congress needs to be overseeing that. Yeah, yeah. And Jinsey had a hand up, and then Howard, and then I think we'll bring it to a conclusion.
My just thought was just in dealing with people who are being aggressive, the tendency to say, oh, shut up, or, to be aggressive back. And I have found, if you really genuinely want to help the person, that it makes all the difference. If you try and punish them, you don't get any response. If you could make them feel that you want them to see, not because you want to hurt them, but because they're hurting themselves. If you can do that, which it's not easy, but if you can do that, it does work.
Yeah. So Jinsey was talking about how, and she had said earlier, what do you say when somebody's saying something offensive? You just say, shut up. She said, actually, that doesn't really work that well. What's better is to just listen and let them know you're listening and you're paying attention. This is all the way of de-escalating it.
Really well to try and understand that they're hurting themselves.
Right.
If you can, and in a way that you want, you're not trying to hurt them. Sometimes that works. Sometimes if you can do it, it works.
And Jinsey's point is that if you can tell someone after they've said something hurtful to you that you don't want to hurt them, that can change things really quickly. So talk about that moving into a place of nobility. That's just it. So we have Howard and then Adam, and then we'll say goodnight. Howard, you had your hand up?
Yes. Returning to contrasting the 18th century with the 21st century, we assume implicitly that freedom of speech entails an identified speaker. And of course, there's a situation in front of us right now in this week's Commons and last week's Commons regarding the anonymous open letter about downtown Marlboro. If you haven't read it, have a look. But in the 18th century, the Federalist Papers were published anonymously under the pseudonym of Publius. And it was historians who later figured out, for example, you cited 51, which Madison wrote, but they had to use stylistic analysis to figure out who wrote which.
Right. So Howard's point about speakers and speech. I'm getting I just realized what the time is, and so because we need to be out of the library rather quickly, Adam, do you have a very quick comment?
I was just kind of thinking about what John was saying about
free speech leads to 800,000 deaths in Rwanda, and then Neely's point about people saying absurd statements, and wondering if it would behoove, if you think it would behoove us to have people kind of, you know, that they make those statements at their own peril, right? And we kind of give them the freedom to be wrong a little bit in their own way. And if it's not the case where, you know, just assuming that free speech leads to negativity kind of denies the agency of each person as someone who can analyze and think through decisions and say, okay, well, do we give in to these violent notions, or do we play to our better angels instead of our baser natures, and just kind of assume that, you know, if we free ourselves from fear, then maybe we won't be making those sets of bad, violent, inducing decisions.
Yeah, so Adam's reinforcing again, if we can free ourselves from fear, boy, would we do a great job of democracy. So thank you very much for coming out.